During the World War II, in the darkest years of the Pacific conflict, Japanese forces captured thousands of Allied soldiers, and among them, a mysterious practice emerged that few outside the camps ever knew about. POWs who were marked with a small red paint symbol on their uniforms carried a silent warning. These were prisoners whom the Japanese considered expendable, either for particularly dangerous labor, secret experiments, or execution. These camps were scattered across remote islands, dense jungles, and coastal regions, often far from the eyes of the wider world. The conditions were brutal. Prisoners were crammed into overcrowded barracks, subjected to harsh climate, and given meager rations barely sufficient to sustain life. Disease and malnutrition were constant companions, and the psychological toll of captivity weighed heavily on every man. The red mark, though seemingly insignificant at first glance, became a quiet indicator of fate. Those who bore it often noticed subtle changes in the way guards treated them, a slightly harsher tone, an insistence on dangerous tasks, or a pointed avoidance when assignments were made. The choice of a red symbol was deliberate. Red has always been associated with danger, blood, and warning, and here it served as a silent but unmistakable code. It was applied quickly, almost casually, yet it carried a weight that words could not express. In the dim light of the barracks, or under the harsh glare of the sun during labor assignments, the mark seemed to stand out to those who had learned to see beyond mere appearances. Men who were previously indistinguishable from their fellow prisoners became suddenly visible targets, noted by those who knew its significance. For the prisoners themselves, the mark was a reminder that their survival depended not on skill, courage, or friendship, but on something far more arbitrary and terrifying: the judgment of those who had captured them. Life inside the camps was a daily negotiation with fear and uncertainty. Some prisoners tried to ignore the mark, hoping that survival could be managed by compliance and quiet endurance. Others, however, could not shake the knowledge that the red paint might determine the next task, the next assignment that could end in death. The mark created an invisible hierarchy among the prisoners, one that shifted with each new round of selections and forced labor. It was a quiet terror that hovered over every interaction, coloring the way men spoke, moved, and even thought. The Japanese officers themselves were meticulous in their approach. Records indicate that the selection process for the red-marked prisoners was not random. It followed patterns based on perceived physical ability, the ability to endure hardship, or sometimes simply as a means to instill fear and obedience among the rest of the camp population. Those chosen for the mark often disappeared from public view, moved to remote work sites, or kept under tighter surveillance. The uncertainty of their fate cast a long shadow over the remaining prisoners, as each man contemplated the possibility that he or his comrades could be next. Witnesses and survivors later described the psychological weight of seeing the mark on a fellow prisoner. Conversations would halt when a man with red paint passed, and small gestures of solidarity were tempered by fear of retribution. The mark, though small, communicated more effectively than any word or command could. It was a silent agreement between captor and captive about the value of human life in the camp. This silent communication created a tension that was impossible to ignore, an ever-present reminder of mortality and the arbitrary cruelty of war. Even the smallest tasks became fraught with danger. A red-marked prisoner sent to repair a bridge, clear debris, or carry supplies might never return. Others were selected for secret experiments, their suffering unknown to the outside world. Their families left to wonder why letters stopped arriving. This invisible system of classification, carried out with simple strokes of paint, became one of the darkest and least understood aspects of POW life in the Pacific Theater. In the heat of the tropics, under monsoon rains, and in the unrelenting glare of the sun, the red symbol seemed to grow in importance. Men memorized its variations, noticing differences in streaks, dots, and placement on the uniform. Each mark told a story, whispered secrets about the individual's supposed expendability, and dictated the level of caution or despair that prisoners felt. Despite the chaos of camp life, the mark provided a chilling form of order, a way for captors to silently manage life and death among their prisoners. Ultimately, the red paint was more than just pigment. It was a weapon of psychological warfare. It reminded men of their vulnerability and of the arbitrary nature of survival in a world dominated by conflict and cruelty. While the outside world remained unaware, inside the camps, the meaning of a single red streak carried the weight of life and death. It was a mark that defined moments, determined tasks, and silently announced the grim reality that, in the darkest years of the Pacific conflict, human life could be quantified by the stroke of a brush. Within the confines of the camps, life was a daily test of endurance, patience, and psychological resilience. The red mark, while physically small, held an almost unbearable significance. It was not a mark that shouted for attention, but one that whispered a deadly secret to those who knew how to read it. Prisoners trained themselves to observe the faint lines and dots on each other's uniforms, realizing that even the slightest difference could signal impending danger. A streak slightly longer than usual, a dot placed on a sleeve rather than a chest pocket. Every subtle variation carried meaning and could alter the behavior of those around it. Men learned to watch, to guess, and sometimes to prepare for the worst simply by noticing the way a fellow prisoner walked or the tasks they were being sent to perform. For the prisoners themselves, the red mark was a constant, silent reminder of mortality. Unlike loud threats or physical punishments, it required no words to instill fear. Each time a marked man was ordered to labor on a perilous assignment or removed from the main camp, others watched in silent terror, imagining their own potential fate. The mark created a shared tension, a collective anxiety that hung over the entire camp like a storm cloud ready to break. Prisoners avoided asking questions, avoided drawing attention, and carefully measured every word and movement, knowing that even a hint of curiosity could be dangerous. The families of these soldiers, far away, could only guess at the horrors their loved ones might have faced. Letters became sporadic or ceased entirely, leaving relatives in agonizing uncertainty. Why did some soldiers never return? Why did some names appear in reports while others seemed to vanish without explanation? The answers, as it turned out, were often tied to that tiny red mark, applied silently and without ceremony. It was a secret that the captors carried with them and that prisoners were too terrified to reveal. Families remained in the dark, unaware that their sons, brothers, and husbands had been selected for tasks that would put them at the greatest risk. Inside the camps, the presence of the red mark affected the social structure of the prisoners. Men instinctively distanced themselves from those who bore it, partly out of fear of association and partly from the instinct to survive. Friendship, camaraderie, and solidarity were tested in new ways. Prisoners, who might have offered comfort, were sometimes forced to step back, understanding that even a small act of empathy could draw unwanted attention. The mark fostered a unique and cruel dynamic. It isolated the most vulnerable while compelling the rest to navigate a tense, unspoken hierarchy. Guard behavior also reflected the secret significance of the mark. Those who had access to the inner circles of authority understood its meaning, and their treatment of marked prisoners could shift subtly but decisively. Orders might be more severe, supervision stricter, or tasks deliberately more dangerous. Conversely, guards who were unaware of the symbol might unknowingly interact without bias. Yet the weight of the mark remained, unseen but lethal. For the prisoners, the knowledge that some guards understood while others did not only heightened the tension, as one never knew whether attention might suddenly turn toward them. The mark also had a psychological ripple effect across the camp. Prisoners with red paint began to move differently, their behavior betraying the knowledge of their status even when they tried to hide it. Fellow prisoners, observing these changes, developed a heightened sense of caution, careful not to draw notice to themselves while constantly calculating the risks of proximity or conversation. Silence became a form of protection, avoidance a survival tactic. The invisible hierarchy imposed by the mark affected everything from mealtimes to labor assignments, from sleeping arrangements to whispered interactions. Stories and rumors circulated quietly, passed in low tones and through fleeting glances. Prisoners speculated about the meaning of the mark, sometimes incorrectly, sometimes with terrifying accuracy. The constant uncertainty made the camp a place of mental and emotional strain as much as physical hardship. Each day brought new examples of the mark's deadly significance. A prisoner sent on a dangerous supply run might return wounded or never return at all. The consequences were immediate and severe, and the psychological impact lasted far longer than any physical scar. In this way, the red mark was more than a symbol. It was a mechanism of control and fear. It allowed the captors to enforce their hierarchy of life and death without words, without explanation, and without debate. Prisoners internalized the danger, walking cautiously, speaking cautiously, and living under the constant silent observation of both guards and fellow captives. The simplicity of a streak or dot carried a profound weight, influencing behavior and shaping survival strategies in ways far beyond its physical appearance. Ultimately, the red mark was a silent arbiter of fate, a hidden code that dictated which men would face the most perilous tasks, which men might vanish without explanation, and which would bear the psychological burden of knowing they had been deemed expendable. Families back home could never understand the significance. Fellow prisoners often could not articulate it, and yet its impact was inescapable. The small red streak or dot was a reminder that survival in that grim theater of war could be measured not by courage, skill, or loyalty, but by the quiet, invisible symbols applied by those in power. In the years following the war, researchers and historians meticulously pieced together accounts from survivors, military archives, and personal correspondence, slowly reconstructing the chilling system that had operated within these POW camps. The red mark, initially seen as a minor notation or incidental paint streak, emerged in these records as a deliberate instrument of control. It was applied according to secret guidelines, often based on physical strength, perceived resilience, or sometimes arbitrary decisions made by camp administrators seeking to instill fear and maintain absolute obedience. These documents revealed a disturbing pattern. Those with the mark were disproportionately assigned to the most dangerous and deadly labor, while others were spared, creating an invisible division among men who were all, in principle, prisoners of the same war. Letters from surviving soldiers, smuggled out or recovered after the war, provided haunting insight into the daily experience of life under this cruel system. Some wrote about the moment they noticed the mark for the first time, a seemingly small blotch that instantly transformed the world around them. Tasks that were once routine became exercises in terror. Every order carried the weight of potential death. Witness testimonies recounted the anxiety of observing fellow prisoners being singled out, their fates sealed with nothing more than a brushstroke. These first-hand accounts, though fragmented, formed a compelling picture of psychological manipulation. The mark functioned not only as a practical tool for assigning dangerous work, but also as a method of mental domination, reinforcing helplessness and submission. The bureaucratic nature of the red mark was particularly chilling. Camp administrators maintained lists, sometimes codified, detailing which prisoners were to be marked and for which purposes. These were not random or chaotic decisions, but systematic classifications, often meticulously recorded in notebooks, ledgers, and internal communications. The mark represented a mechanized form of judgment, a cold and impersonal determination of who would face the harshest labor, who might be subjected to experiments, and who could be executed without formal charge or trial. Survivors later described the terrifying sense of invisibility and powerlessness that accompanied this bureaucracy. Life and death were dictated by rules and procedures that were impossible to influence, appeal, or understand. Testimonies also revealed the emotional and social consequences of the system. Prisoners who bore the red mark were often isolated, both physically and emotionally. Their peers, aware of the mark's significance, would sometimes avoid contact, fearful of sharing the same fate or drawing suspicion. This isolation deepened the psychological torment, compounding the dangers of already brutal labor assignments. Prisoners became hyper-aware of every action, every word, and every movement, constantly measuring risk and reading the subtle signals of authority. The mark, though physically minimal, created a pervasive and omnipresent form of psychological control, reinforcing the hierarchy of fear. Some of the most harrowing fragments historians uncovered were the testimonies describing forced labor under life-threatening conditions. Red-marked prisoners were assigned to build bridges over swollen rivers, clear mines, or carry heavy loads through sweltering jungles. Others were sent to work in medical or scientific experiments where survival was uncertain and the outcomes often fatal. The bureaucratic mark translated abstract decisions into concrete danger. A simple stroke of red paint signaled the beginning of a pathway that could lead to exhaustion, injury, or death. These records also included post-war debriefings, where survivors recounted how the subtle sign was recognized by certain guards and officers, ensuring that the assignment of tasks was carried out with ruthless precision. Letters and diaries also revealed an unsettling awareness among prisoners of the systemic cruelty. Even those who were not marked felt the oppressive shadow of the red paint, recognizing that it represented a larger mechanism of control and dehumanization. Men internalized the threat, understanding that survival depended not only on physical endurance, but also on awareness, discretion, and sometimes sheer luck. The bureaucracy behind the mark demonstrated the methodical nature of cruelty. It was not spontaneous or random, but carefully constructed to maximize terror and minimize resistance. Historians, piecing together these fragments decades later, faced the challenge of reconstructing events where documentation was incomplete, intentionally destroyed, or hidden. Yet even the scattered evidence painted a chilling portrait. A system in which human lives were evaluated, categorized, and assigned risk through impersonal, administrative decisions. The red mark was emblematic of this logic, a small but potent symbol of the extraordinary lengths to which captors went to maintain control, enforce compliance, and administer cruelty with bureaucratic precision. In sum, the uncovering of these records, letters, and testimonies revealed the terrifying calculus behind a seemingly innocuous mark. It was a system where the value of a life could be reduced to a line of paint, a code in a ledger, or a note in a file. The red mark represented the fusion of administrative order with human brutality, illustrating that in the darkest chapters of the Pacific conflict, even the minutest detail could determine life and death. Through painstaking historical research, the silent story of those marked in red emerged, offering the world a glimpse into the horrifying logic of wartime bureaucracy and the devastating human cost it exacted. The psychological weight of the red mark persisted long after liberation. For many former prisoners, returning home did not immediately bring relief or peace. Instead, the memory of the camps remained vivid, etched deeply into the mind. Each man remembered the subtle, almost imperceptible streak or dot, its presence carrying with it the knowledge that life and death had been assigned without reason, without trial, and without mercy. Survivors often found themselves haunted by the faces of those who had disappeared, men whose lives had been ended or endangered by a system that reduced them to symbols, mere objects in a cruel bureaucratic calculation. Conversations with family and friends proved difficult. How could one explain the significance of a small red mark to someone who had never experienced the constant, oppressive tension of a POW camp? Survivors struggled to convey the weight of the silent warning, the fear that accompanied even simple tasks, and the endless uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. Some turned to journals, letters, or memoirs, trying to capture in words the emotional and psychological burden that the mark had imposed. Others chose silence, feeling that no explanation could truly communicate the depth of the horror they had endured. The mark's significance extended beyond physical survival. It had forced prisoners to navigate a social hierarchy under extreme duress, to adjust behavior to avoid attracting attention, and to endure the stress of constantly evaluating both their own position and that of their fellow captives. Even decades later, these mental and emotional patterns persisted. Survivors often reflected on the subtle strategies they had developed to live another day, from avoiding eye contact with certain guards to quietly supporting one another while maintaining the appearance of obedience. The red mark was a reminder that survival in the camps was not only about strength or courage, but about constant vigilance, observation, and psychological endurance. Many survivors also carried guilt, a painful burden tied to the randomness of who had been marked and who had not. They mourned the loss of friends who had disappeared, knowing that fate had singled them out for cruel tasks. The knowledge that a single stroke of paint could determine life or death weighed heavily, creating a sense of helplessness that lingered for years. The arbitrary nature of the red mark became a symbol of the larger injustice of war, illustrating how human lives could be quantified, manipulated, and destroyed by forces far beyond an individual's control. The memory of the mark also influenced how survivors viewed authority and discipline in later life. The strict, methodical control exercised by their captors left lasting impressions, shaping attitudes toward hierarchy, compliance, and trust. The mark was more than just a symbol of a singular event. It was a testament to the profound and lasting impact of psychological manipulation. It demonstrated how fear could be administered subtly, invisibly, yet with precision, creating consequences that extended far beyond the immediate context of the camps. Historians, psychologists, and social researchers later examined the experiences of these survivors to understand the long-term effects of such trauma. They noted that the red mark functioned as a focal point of fear, a constant reminder of the arbitrary cruelty embedded within the camp's strict discipline. Survivors reported recurrent memories, flashbacks, and emotional responses even decades after their release. Some described dreams in which the mark reappeared, signaling danger or impending doom. Others spoke of moments in daily life when a glimpse of red would evoke a visceral, involuntary response. The mark, though small and simple, had imprinted itself permanently on the psyche, a symbol of human vulnerability and the extreme consequences of systemic cruelty. Art, literature, and memoirs also captured the profound significance of the red mark. Through paintings, novels, and personal accounts, the silent warning became a powerful emblem of wartime suffering and human resilience. Writers and artists sought to convey how a seemingly minor detail could encapsulate the full horror of imprisonment, manipulation, and fear. The mark's story transcended individual memory, becoming part of the collective understanding of the human cost of war, a reminder of how bureaucratic systems could enforce cruelty with meticulous precision. For decades, survivors carried these memories quietly, often sharing them selectively, aware that the depth of suffering they represented could be difficult for others to comprehend. They lived with the dual awareness of having survived extraordinary danger and having been subjected to a system that treated life as a variable, a quantity to be managed, categorized, and ultimately sacrificed at will. The red mark was a symbol of this system, embodying the fear, manipulation, and unimaginable cruelty hidden behind the discipline of war. Ultimately, the stroke of red paint was more than a mark. It was a representation of human endurance, the fragile boundary between life and death, and the extraordinary psychological weight that such experiences could impose. Survivors' lives were indelibly shaped by this memory, a reminder that in war, even the smallest symbol could carry the heaviest burden, a testament to the invisible scars that persisted long after the conflict had ended. The red mark remained a silent witness, echoing through the decades, a warning of the fragility of life and the depths of human cruelty hidden beneath. The order and discipline of wartime authority.